My name is Spencer and this occurred when I was a sophomore in college. Since I didn't get a dorm after freshman year, I scrambled for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op that was part of a three-house community located somewhat near campus but not exactly. It wasn't perfect, yet it was inexpensive and my options were limited. Plus, I had a bike so the extra travel time didn't bother me much. Most of the residents were young students like myself, but there were a few exceptions. There were some alumni, a couple of graduate assistants, and a few older people returning to school later in life. However, the person who immediately caught my attention was an older woman living in one of the other houses. From what I could tell, she was probably in her late 50s, though she appeared a bit older. She had graying hair and walked with a slight limp, as if suffering from a back injury. She was very quiet, mostly keeping to herself, and always wore a blank expression on her face. I assumed she must have had some kind of connection to the university, perhaps faculty or an alum, but no one ever explained, and I didn't ask. The first time I noticed her odd behavior was in our shared kitchen, which was strange enough because the other two houses had their own kitchens. I couldn't understand why she would be there. She wasn't cooking, eating, or talking to anyone. She was merely standing there as the rest of us chatted, prepared dinner, and listened to music. She didn't try to join in at all, she simply observed us with a vacant look. I caught her eye a few times, and a part of me felt she was watching me specifically, even though I knew that was unlikely. No one acknowledged her presence, which I found a bit odd. Perhaps they knew something I didn't. Later that week, while I was doing homework in my room, I saw her again. I glanced out my bedroom window and there she was, staring right at me. As if that weren't strange enough, she wasn't even on the sidewalk but rather in the middle of the street. It was getting late and rather cold, so she must have been freezing out there. I couldn't tell if she was peering directly into my window or just looking in the general direction of the house, but it felt as if she was focused on me. I don't know why, but I waved at her in an attempt to be friendly. The moment I did, I instantly regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she began jumping up and down as if excited, then ran toward one of the other houses, presumably her own. I felt quite sick. Not only had I acknowledged her, but I had also confirmed that she had been watching my room all along, and even if that weren't true, she now knew exactly which room was mine. Later that night, I asked one of my housemates about her. He told me that the woman had always been around and that I should try my best to ignore her, just as everyone else did. I inquired further, but the guy genuinely didn't know anything beyond repeating what someone had told him when he moved in. That didn't sit right with me, so I asked around until I got a semblance of an answer. One of the seniors from the specific house where she lived mentioned that she was associated with the university and a bit eccentric, though she had no history of violence or physical altercations. I asked why no one found her behavior as strange as I did, and he explained that they really couldn't control who lived there because the property manager made those decisions. I wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer, but there was nothing I could do about it, so I tried to push thoughts of her out of my mind. But then it got worse. One night I walked out of my room and almost ran right into her. She was standing in the hallway directly in front of my door. I literally jumped back because her sudden appearance completely caught me off guard. It was past midnight on a Tuesday, so the house was mostly empty. She didn't say anything when she saw me, barely even reacting. Instead, she simply turned and walked away as if I were the intruder. I'm not going to recount every little detail, but there were several more incidents where I caught her snooping in places she had no business being or doing things she shouldn't have been doing. At one point, I lost my room key, even though all three houses had originally been part of the same hotel and every room had personal locks and keys. Since it was a co-op, most people left their doors unlocked, but I couldn't sleep knowing someone might just walk into my room, so losing my key was a big deal. Everyone had a spare key, including me, but I was frustrated because I'd have to get a new copy, which was an extra hassle I couldn't afford at the time. A few nights later, I woke up randomly in the night. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it, a soft bumping coming from my closet every 20 seconds or so, as if something was shifting behind the door. I'm not one to get scared easily and I'm definitely not one to be helpless in a dangerous situation, so I decided to handle it myself. I quietly got out of bed, took a deep breath, and slowly walked to the closet, trying to control my breathing even though my heart was racing. In one swift motion, I yanked the closet door open and screamed like a madman. Just as I had feared, the woman was in there. She had one of my ties wrapped around her neck, her eyes wide open, and she was holding a kitchen knife in her other hand. My scream must have startled her because, before I could react, she lunged at me with the knife extended. I screamed again, this time a genuine cry of fear, as I wrestled her to the ground and managed to disarm her quite easily given her small, frail frame. That didn't make the situation any less terrifying, though, as she kicked, fought, and bit while I pinned her down, all while screaming. I yelled for help and soon heard doors slamming followed by my housemates rushing down the hall. My friend Travis immediately helped me hold her down while someone else called the police. The rest of the night was a blur. The police arrived quickly and arrested her on the spot. By then, she had stopped screaming, but she refused to say a word, which was extremely unsettling. The cops even found my room key on her, a real shocker. A few weeks later, we finally learned the truth about her. Apparently, she was the property manager's sister, whom he had been secretly housing. She suffered from severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her proper care, he had simply dumped her into one of the vacant rooms. I believe the property manager was eventually arrested for negligence and a host of other reasons, and rightfully so. I honestly blame him far more for what happened than I do her. If anything, I feel some pity for her, but that pity won't erase the fact that she tried to kill me. I could have lost my life that night. I have no idea why she seemed so fixated on me specifically, but I can only hope nothing like that ever happens again. I'm graduating soon, and while I'll definitely miss college, I doubt I'll ever be able to look back on my time here without remembering that night. This isn't exactly my story, but I essentially witnessed the whole thing, so I'm sharing it anyway. I've lived in a modest two-story home with my husband Samuel for nearly 20 years now. All of our kids have moved out, and I couldn't be prouder. But I'm about to tell you what happened last year. Someone just moved into the house across the street, which was really nice because I was tired of looking at a vacant building all the time. I'm retired, so I spend plenty of time on my front porch, knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with my husband, and you name it. I also listen to a lot of true crime podcasts and sometimes play music. The person who moved into the house across the street was a young guy, maybe in his mid-20s. He drove an expensive BMW and always dressed in flashy clothes, so I assumed he was either well off or just putting on an act. I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression about him because, despite appearances, he was actually very sweet. He introduced himself to us a few days later. His name was Dylan, and he was a few years out of college, just as I had guessed. He was a really bright fellow and got along exceptionally well with Samuel. They laughed, talked about sports, and Samuel even shared some of his own college stories that I hadn't heard in a long time. Dylan mentioned he worked in the entertainment industry, doing freelance work for an internet personality or something of that nature. It went over my head, but it must have paid well, as he looked quite affluent. He discussed stocks with Samuel and explained some of the investments he was making. Overall, he seemed like a genuinely nice guy. For a few months everything was normal. Since I spent a lot of time on my porch, Dylan would often wave to me when leaving his house, and I always waved back. I can't remember exactly when, but I began noticing the same girl frequently heading over to Dylan's house. She drove a small white convertible, and she was a pretty young blonde, the kind of girl you'd expect someone like him to date. To be frank, she dressed rather provocatively, which I didn't entirely appreciate. I figured she was his girlfriend, perhaps checking on the house while he was away, since she had her own key. This routine became regular. Maybe once or twice a week, I'd see that car roll up while Dylan was absent. She'd go inside, stay for a while, then leave. I didn't really understand her behavior, but young people date differently these days, so I kept my thoughts to myself. Then one evening, I saw them together. Dylan pulled into his driveway with her in the passenger seat, which confirmed my suspicion that she was his girlfriend. Shortly after that day, though, things started to feel tense. One afternoon, I was tending to my small garden when I heard shouting from across the street. Dylan and the girl were standing in his driveway, yelling at each other. I couldn't catch what they were arguing about, but I didn't need to. She was throwing her hands in the air and practically spitting her words at him. It looked like she might even strike him. Eventually, she got into the car, slammed the door, and sped off. Dylan shook his head and went back inside. I don't think he even noticed me. I figured it was just one of those lovers' spats that happen every couple of weeks, and it wasn't my place to interfere. But then, I saw that girl's car in front of his house again, not once, not twice, but multiple times. I told Samuel about it, and he said it was rude to pry, advising me to leave the poor boy alone, which I agreed with. Then came the night when everything went sideways. Samuel and I were asleep when we woke up to sirens blaring outside. We rushed out, joining a few neighbors who had come to see what was happening. Dylan's house was swarming with police cars and even an ambulance. We watched as officers emerged from his house with that girl in handcuffs. She didn't struggle or scream, she just accepted what was happening with a blank look. We then saw Dylan being rushed outside on a stretcher. He was a bloody mess, and I gasped at the sight. We didn't see him for a week afterward, and I was terribly worried when he finally returned. Samuel and I went over to check on him. He let us in without hesitation and explained everything. Apparently, that girl, named Ava, had confessed to everything, making it easy for the police. For starters, she wasn't supposed to have access to his house. She had stolen his spare key and made a copy without his knowledge. According to Dylan, she began asking him for fancy dinners, jewelry, and expensive trips, and when he hesitated, she became possessive and angry. Then things went downhill in their relationship. Every time she showed up unannounced at his house, he had no idea that she could track his location through his phone, which I never even knew was possible. She had rummaged through all his belongings, and worst of all, she had planted hidden cameras in his room. Each time she visited, she would replace the batteries and make sure they were still working. The argument I overheard was Dylan's attempt at breaking up with her. She refused, and Dylan reluctantly agreed to take a break. Ava had been watching everything through the cameras, and the following night she went to his house with a knife. I won't go into all the details, you get the idea. Somehow, Dylan managed to get her off the premises, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctor said he was an inch away from needing surgery or worse. Samuel and I tried to console him, but he was visibly shaken. The last thing he said before we left was that he'd learned his lesson about flaunting his wealth, especially around attractive women. He moved out not long after, saying he no longer felt safe in that house, and that his ex had a lot of friends just like her. He wasn't comfortable knowing they might have known his whereabouts. We never saw him again, and I pray every day that he's okay. No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not someone so young. When I moved into my new place, I was just looking for a fresh start. I won't go into too many details, but let's just say I had a messy situation with an ex that made staying in my old city impossible. I came into some money early on and made a few poor choices about the type of women I surrounded myself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I moved to is really nice, low crime, quiet, and mostly families. The houses here are very spread out, which partly drew me in. For some reason, however, the property next door is much closer than most of the others, and by the way, that house is huge. When I first saw it, I assumed it could easily accommodate a family of 10, grandparents included, but I couldn't have been more mistaken. Even though I tried to be low-key and not a rude neighbor, I decided to introduce myself to everyone in the area. For whatever reason, I opted to introduce myself via the Nextdoor app, since everyone I met seemed really friendly and genuine, even though about 90% were parents of young children and, frankly, a bit intimidating given their success. I wasn't sure how a younger guy like me would blend into such a community, but that was more of a personal worry. When I finally met my next-door neighbor, I was completely drained from spending the day making small talk with strangers. I knew that if I went back home, I'd lose all motivation to meet them, so I mustered up the courage and walked up to their driveway. I had gotten used to being greeted by someone middle-aged, so when a young-looking guy with a mullet opened the door, I was a bit taken aback. He looked even younger than me, which was definitely surprising. I quickly recovered and went on with my usual, new to the neighborhood, spiel. He flashed me a huge smile and actually interrupted me before I could finish, saying something like, "Oh wow, someone born in my decade, what a nice surprise." I laughed and replied similarly, venting about how out of place I felt as a single guy in my late 20s among so many families with kids. He told me not to worry and that most people here kept to themselves, which was a relief. He introduced himself as Jared and suggested I come by for a drink sometime. I shrugged and said, hell, why not right now, expecting him to laugh and invite me in, but instead, he glanced over his shoulder as if scanning his living room and then said he wished he could, but he was busy working. I asked him what he did for work, which seemed like a normal follow-up question, and he dropped his smile a bit after giving me a strange stare. He simply replied, finance, without elaborating further, which I found odd. I said, fair enough, and asked if he had any roommates. Surprisingly, he told me he lived there alone, which seemed insane given the size of the house. We chatted for a few more minutes and he gave me his number before heading back inside. I was excited that someone my age lived nearby, especially since he seemed like a really chill guy, but I couldn't shake how odd it was for someone like him to live completely alone. I know, I was essentially doing the same thing, but my place isn't even half the size of his. I went back home and carried on with my life. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful happened. I even texted Jared a few days after he gave me his number to set something up, but he always complained about being busy and apologized that we couldn't hang out. Eventually, I gave up on him, not in a hostile way, just in a you do you kind of way, since I'm not the type to bend over backwards for someone who seems disinterested. I never saw anyone coming or going from Jared's place, no visitors, no parties, no girls. He never even got takeout delivered, which was strange because his car was always in the driveway. I genuinely never saw him leave the house, and he practically lived like a ghost. I work from home, and the office in my house is on the 3rd floor, overlooking Jared's property. If you're wondering how I knew so much about his habits, well, his house was just a glance away from my monitor, so I couldn't help but look over occasionally. One Wednesday night, I remember it clearly, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of loud music. I sleep with my windows open, so I woke up easily. At first, I thought I was dreaming or imagining it, but I got out of bed and peeked out the window, and there they were, 7 or so cars lined up in Jared's driveway. There was no mistaking it, he was throwing a party. Now, I'm not one to complain about a bit of noise. I've been to plenty of house parties, but it was the middle of the week and the volume was insane. I figured I'd just go over, knock, and ask him to turn it down. I threw on a hoodie and walked over. From the outside, it was clear this was a full-blown party. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I pulled out my phone to text Jared, but then decided against it, knowing he'd probably ignore me with some lame excuse. The following morning, I knocked on the door again, this time harder, but still, nothing. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door swung open. Inside, the first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs, but something felt off. There was no one in the room. I moved further in, expecting to see people in the living room or maybe the kitchen, but it was completely empty, not even any drinks were left out. I could faintly hear people over some background music, which I didn't understand at first, but then I really listened, and everything clicked. It wasn't music at all, it was a recording, the sound of people laughing, yelling, and clinking glasses. The entire party was fake. That still didn't explain the shoes or the cars outside. There were definitely people inside that house. I should have turned around right then, but I needed to know what was happening. I moved quietly around the house until I found a door that was slightly ajar. I gently pushed it open and discovered it led to the basement. I'm not sure why, but something told me that what I was looking for was downstairs. It was dark there except for a faint light coming from somewhere I couldn't see. Even though I knew there was no real reason to go down, I did it anyway. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The light was coming from another door deeper in the basement. I crept toward it, and as I got closer, I began to pick up on another noise that had been drowned out by the music, a heavy, rhythmic grinding sound, almost like machinery or a buzz saw. I edged in closer, peering through a crack. and saw 3 people standing there, all looking across the room at something hidden from view. They were all older men, significantly older than Jared, wearing heavy-duty work clothes, protective goggles, thick rubber gloves, and what looked like sturdy work boots. I would have assumed they were construction workers, especially given the shoes I'd seen upstairs under different circumstances. I really wanted to see what they were examining, but it was too far away. After a few seconds of watching, I started to notice an awful bleach smell, or perhaps some kind of cleaning solution, that made my stomach drop and filled me with a sense of imminent danger. I can't explain it, but I turned to leave as quietly as possible, making my way back to the stairs. Then, suddenly, the light behind me dimmed, as if someone had shut a door. I didn't actually hear the door close over the music, but I felt it. I sprinted up the stairs as fast as I could, ran through the house, and burst out the front door. I didn't run straight to my house, I jumped my own fence and made it to the backyard, slipping in through my side door and locking it behind me. My chest was pounding, but under no circumstances could I let Jared or any of those other guys know that I'd been snooping around. I gathered myself and went up to my office, making sure all the lights were off. I crouched by the window and peered over at Jared's house. Initially, there was no one there, but a few minutes later, the front door flew open and about 8 men poured out, scanning the yard, driveway, and street, but Jared wasn't with them. I could tell because they all looked older, like those 3 men I had seen earlier. A few of them even appeared to be arguing, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. One of the men shoved another, and for a moment, I thought a fight was about to break out on the street, but they eventually all went back inside and the music stopped shortly afterward. I stood at my window, trying to piece together what had just happened. I considered calling the cops, but what would I even say? The music had stopped, and there wasn't any clear crime I could report. What I couldn't understand was how none of my other neighbors had complained about the loud music, especially since many of them had children. I figured that if they had heard it and I called the police, Jared would know it was me, and the shoes, I still had no idea what that was about either. So many questions swirled in my mind, and I just went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. The cars were all gone, including Jared's. I went upstairs trying to work, but I couldn't concentrate and kept glancing at Jared's house every few seconds. After a few hours of his car being absent, I decided to go for a walk, partly to clear my head and partly to sneak low-key glances through his windows, but I saw nothing. Days passed and Jared still hadn't returned, his car was nowhere to be seen, and I was baffled by how my other neighbors had slept through all the noises that night. So, I decided to ask around. I went to a few houses and asked if anyone had heard about the party that had taken place at his house a few nights ago. No one knew what I was talking about, even after I mentioned which house it was and how late it was. I thought I was going crazy. This was a few months ago. Now, the strangest part is that Jared still hasn't returned, and it's clear that no one is taking care of his house. The grass is getting really long and there's a pile of undisturbed packages leaning against his front door. I don't know what to make of it. It could be nothing, but I feel that no one would go to such lengths to cover up a party unless they were involved in something illegal. Maybe those were the very things the men had been arguing about. I really have no idea. The fact that none of my other neighbors seemed bothered by it makes me think that I might be caught up in some huge conspiracy or something. I know I'm just being paranoid, but I have so many unanswered questions that when Jared returns, if he ever does, I'm seriously debating whether or not I should just go and ask him directly.